Finally, we would like to end our opening now and help introduce our keynote speaker for today. It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, who will discuss her amazing discoveries in science and social impact. Despite her various qualifications and accolades, including a master's and PhD in neuroscience from Carnegie Mellon University, the Apollo Project Award by the Interlaw Diversity Forum, and one of the BBC's top 100 women in 2017, she prefers the title Mad Scientist. She has achieved international recognition for her work in fields such as artificial intelligence and neuroscience, and co-founded and is the director of a philanthropic think tank called Sokos Labs, through which she designs AI systems and help resolving pressing issues facing the world, ranging from disparities in science to education and health policy. Furthermore, she is the chief director at Diagnostics Health, a company dedicated to tackling mental health through tracking and understanding, and today she will discuss the future of artificial intelligence and its role in education. Please join me in giving Dr. Vivian Ming a warm welcome at our symposium today.
So just to have a sense, everyone who's a high school student, raise your hand. All right, and the faculty and grad students? Not that many. Parents? Okay, so no F-bombs. This is on, everyone can hear me while I walk around? All right. By the way, that's a genuine question. I have occasionally gone blue only to discover some little kid sitting up front next to their grandmother, and it doesn't go well. Oh gosh, so I can imagine, as I look out at you, that many of you have had an educational experience that is very much like my wife's, in a variety of different ways. She and her two sisters are first-generation Americans growing up in upstate New York. Their dad from Taiwan worked at IBM. Their mom, who had some fancy degrees themselves, they actually met at Carnegie Mellon, which is in fact where my wife and I met also, so apparently she's part salmon. So they grew up, and they had perfect grades, and they had perfect test scores. I don't know if anyone here, first year violin, math camp every summer. If this describes you, you have some idea of my wife's life. And then she and her two sisters, MIT, Harvard, sort of this classic story of that first generation experience. That's not me. I'm very much a white kid from coastal California. I was not a perfect student. But rather than tell you about that, I'm going to come back to it. Let me pick up halfway through this story. And along the way, you'll get a sense of some of the work I've had the chance to do over the years. So, I did my undergrad at UC San Diego. And I showed up there in 1999. Just to be super clear, I know that sounds like a long time ago for some of you, but there's a giant 10-year gap in my story that we'll come back to. So 1999 comes after a very long delay. But I show up at UC San Diego and I think to myself something completely absurd. I'm going to finish my entire undergraduate degree in a single year and go on and do a PhD. And I don't care what I'm going to study. That's not true. I'm an incredible snob. So only an actual technical degree in something. So there were three things I could do in a single year: math, economics, and cognitive neuroscience. I thought, math, what am I going to do with that? Little did I know how the rest of my career would go. So I literally flipped a coin between economics and neuroscience. And it came up heads. So I studied brains. I mean, I guess if they come up tails, what's the metaphor there? It'd be an ass, so I'd study economics. There's some actual new research. There's so many things. This is a strange thing. You wouldn't have thought this from the early part of my life, but I actually really enjoy giving talks. And my problem is I want to say so much, and I always run over time. I'm a terrible radio interview, which many a radio and TV station have discovered as they begin weeping because I won't shut the hell up. Which is also generally how I realize it's time for me to get off the stage. So just weep loudly, and I'll know it's my time to go. So study brains, completely arbitrary, right? This was not something I had spent my entire life and had a passion about. I had been directed at this for years and years. Life gave me the first in the world cognitive science department at UC San Diego, and in particular a subspecialty in cognitive neuroscience. And I just embraced it. Sat up in the front row of every class. And I wasn't there to get perfect grades. I was there because I wanted to build something that would make people's lives better. And I know that sounds like, oh, that's the coarse philosophical. Again, we're going to come back to the first part of my story later. But genuinely, I sat up front and I wasn't thinking, how do I ace this class? I was thinking, what can I use from what's being said? Everything was there, context for me. How can I use this? What can I build from this? And the amazing thing was that first quarter, UC San Diego was on a quarter system, that first quarter, I got perfect grades. I mean, literally, I got perfect scores in every class. The only programming course I've ever taken, Introduction to C for Cognitive Modeling. I've written so many lines of code in my life. One programming course. Because turns out you can learn stuff like that anywhere. The big punchline of my entire presentation here is, I gave a talk at the Department of Education once many, many years ago, and I was asked, how do we robot-proof our kids? And the most standard answer you'll get is teach everyone how to program, or teach them all about AI. Alpha, DeepMind, Google's subsidiary, my friend of mine, my office mate in grad school is their chief neuroscientist. They just released something called Alpha Code. You just give it a coding channel, like a challenge, like if any of you do Kaggle competitions. You just give it the problem, and it writes the lines of code, and it's competitive with other people in those challenges. So, tell me again how knowing how to code is going to be your magic ticket to a great career. Or learning about AI, that's what a Kaggle competition is. Data science, AI, what's the difference? So I take this one class and I get a perfect score. The professor invites me in. And he says, I just want you to know, you got the top grade in the class, you got everything right. Be my teaching assistant next year. I said, sure. And I hope you don't mind. I've recommended you as a research assistant for this place called the Machine Perception Lab. So if any of you truly are a computational AI nerd, this was something run by this very famous guy named Terry Sinofsky at UC San Diego and the Salk Institute, the kind of professor that his professors working for him. And we had funding from the CIA to do real-time lie detection off of raw video from faces. So, a little morally gray, I will not deny that, but as someone that knew nothing about machine learning at the time, walking into this project, and my undergraduate honors thesis was, actually I did two. This may seem bragging as I go along. Again, we're going to come back to the first part of my story. So my second undergraduate honors thesis was a system that learned to read people's facial expressions. I wrote codes, and I know that doesn't seem amazing to you, but it's 1999, and I wrote code and trained it on faces, and it could tell if people were smiling or not. In fact, it could tell if it was a Duchenne versus non-Duchenne smile, a real smile versus a false one, which, if you're not familiar, it's contraction of the supraorbital muscles, not what's going on with your mouth. So, build this thing, and I was just hooked. I still wanted to study brains, but the idea of just being able to write code and show it the world, and it would learn things. And then in my case, maybe what it learned says something about the brain. I was absolutely hooked. So a small side note, that lab, which always seemed a little distant from cognitive science, a little bit more on the engineering and AI side of things. Ended up spinning off as a startup called Emotion, I think. I've had a lot of companies, so I lose track of the names sometimes. So, called Emotion, and it took kind of years. So their idea was facial expression analysis as a product, which sounds really cool. But if you think hard, why would I buy that? Who's gonna buy that? Wasn't clear, certainly wasn't clear in the year 2006, or 2010, or 2015. They've got lots of funding. Now they've got deep neural networks, right? None of this existed in 1999. It was a very different space for machine learning. It was genuinely more scientific research than actual engineering. But by 2015, everyone's working on deep neural networks. So they've put this into their face recognition models. Now they're working really well and in real time using GPUs. So they have this clever idea. They picked one of the Republican presidential debates, the primaries, in 2015, when there were still like 97 of them. Again, I realize if you're in high school, this seems like a very long time, even 2015, but before Trump tied down the nomination, there were so many, they had 2 separate sets of debates because there were so many people. And people wanted to know, so they did a real-time expression analysis of the debate that's simulcast on YouTube. So you could tell whether Ted Cruz actually has human emotions. My favorite statement ever about Ted Cruz was made by Tom DeLay, I think. No, someone else, but the head of the Senate, the Republican head of the Senate, was being interviewed by a reporter, and as he's turning to walk away, the reporter says, and it's right there on camera, it's so great, he says, by the way, why do people just instantly dislike Ted Cruz? And the head of his own party immediately said, it saves time. So they ran this thing in real time. Literally the next day, the bidding war started between Facebook and Apple. Apple won. So if any of you have an iPhone on you, all of that face recognition, that's my undergraduate lab. If you unlock your phone with your face, if you've ever done an Animoji and you talk, and the little animal, there's a cat on the other side that's smiling because you're smiling. We were literally working on that in 1999. Just so you know, $50 million of CIA funding and decades of graduate research, so much computation now animates cats on your phone. Which is, it doesn't matter what you research. You could do CRISPR, you could do AI, any new field. In the end, cats on the internet. That's what it all ends up being. So I'm hooked on this idea of using machine learning as a tool. By the way, if I were invited to truly give a talk about AI, that would be my punchline. It's not a magic wand. It can't solve problems we don't already understand and have solutions to. It's an astonishingly powerful tool for changing the economics of those solutions. But if you think it's somehow going to magically fix the problems that plague the world, and we don't have to figure them out for ourselves, then suddenly you are now adding to the problems. But let's keep this story going. I went to Carnegie Mellon. I went there because it's interdisciplinary. I ended up choosing between 2 genuinely great schools, MIT and Carnegie Mellon. MIT is a highly competitive place. If that's what you love, I don't know, other than of course here, that there's a better place to go. Just incredibly, grindingly competitive. Everyone that wrote my recommendation letters, they either loved it or hated it. CMU, everyone had something positive to say. The question at CMU was, oh, who are you collaborating with? You know, who outside of your department are you working with? Which just seemed to fit me. There's not a general world right answer, but boy, that fit me, so I went there and I mashed up machine learning and neuroscience and psychology. And so I should say, I did do my entire undergraduate degree in a single year, and I did get obscenely good grades. Again, I'm going to come back to that. But I'm now at CMU. Well, actually, along the way, I am interviewing to go to MIT and CMU and Northwestern and all these other schools. And I remember at Northwestern, there was this prospective student sitting next to me. And I said, you know, pretending to actually have social skills, of which I have none. Like, autistic badgers are sort of look down on my social skills. So I turned to them and said, what are you interested in studying? And they started talking about this protein cascade in yeast. And I'm like, yeast? It's, just so you know, to molecular neuroscientists, you're all approximately yeast. You know, it's sort of the molecular neuroscience version of the spherical cow. And then they said, so what do you want to study? And I said, cyborgs. And they scooted away from me for genuine fear that my crazy would rub off and they wouldn't get in either. But it turns out the appropriate name for this field is neuroprosthetics. What if we could take the best of what machines could do and what brains could do and bring them together? And of course, the most immediate case, work which has been greatly advanced right here at UC Berkeley, is in motor neuroprosthetics, allowing people to, using their motor cortex or their parietal lobes, to actually drive robotic limbs or steer a wheelchair. At the time that I got involved in this, around 2000, it also, like machine learning, was just sort of science. There was some cool work being done. There's a thing called BrainGate, which the videos of which are still online on YouTube. You can look at them. And what's amazing about it is, you know, that's approaching 20 years old at this point. And even then, what people were doing, implanting chronically implanted electrodes in people's motor cortex, and just using their mind and moving cursors on screens, moving robotic limbs. And again, seeing that 15, 20 years ago was amazing, and wanting to be a part of that sort of work really drove me forward. So I built models that learn how to hear. I wasn't as interested in motor. I wanted to do sensory neuroprosthetics and cognitive neuroprosthetics. Maybe there's something we could do for people with Alzheimer's or kids with traumatic brain injury to change the whole course of their lives. In this particular case, got to publish some fancy papers about using machine learning. You know, I literally took it into parks around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and just walked around with microphones that would listen to birds sing and babbling brooks and the snapping of twigs, and it learned the statistics of natural sound, which turned out to provide a profoundly deep insight from an information theory perspective about how the mammalian ear works, why it does what it does. A whole lot less about what, because that wasn't our model. Our model was abstract and theoretical. But why does the ear hear the way it does? Do the eyes see the way they do? Why do we have the motor patterns that we use? So this was my graduate experience. And again, I loved using this thing, machine learning, as a tool to understand something else. And I also got to actually work on neuroprosthetics. We developed an algorithm to improve the function of cochlear implants, which I have to say is kind of addictive. So a cochlear implant is like a hearing aid, except that it wires into the eighth cranial nerve, or wires into your brain, which stores hearing, people that have profound deafness from peripheral hearing loss. And I ran an experiment using our system versus a regular hearing aids in a simulation for undergrads, and suddenly, just like that, they were hearing 50% more higher accuracy in identifying what was being said to them through this system. And again, the idea that you could build something which could directly affect and change someone's life, was, to me, addictive. My wife and I came here. She was faculty at the School of Education, and I had a joint appointment at the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience and a place over at Stanford. It's not highly recommended to drive back and forth every week, but at the time it seemed like a good idea. And I got to do my research in this space. But then she could do, all right, this is only for people whose hair is white and or falling out. She got her education in my machine learning, and I got my machine learning in her education, a good old-fashioned Reese's peanut butter cup analogy, really on target for an audience of high schoolers who were not alive a million years ago, but that was a commercial. So we had this idea for using AI in education. And we thought, is this an experiment? Or is it something we wanted to exist in the world? And so I started my first tech startup. And boy, let me tell you, nobody wanted to fund an AI education tech startup. One, at that time, there was no Coursera, there's no Khan Academy, there's no one's doing AI for any purpose still at that point. Not as we would think of it today. And there's no real ed tech industry, just nascent. And they also very much, and I'll be really blunt about it, did not want to fund two women starting a startup. One of them told me rather directly, they love the AI, they love the technology. Here's $2 million if you do financial fraud detection, and I get to pick the CEO. Just so you know, I was the CEO in the conversation with him, right across the table. And he insisted on firing me if he wanted to fund me. So, but we managed to build this anyways. We published papers. I got invited to the Department of Education. We had this amazing experience. Ended up selling the company. I started another education company. Became the first chief scientist, the founding chief scientist of a company doing AI in hiring. Built a data set of 122 million people, where we collected 400,000 data points on every person to predict who would be good at jobs they never held. By the way, such a challenging thing to do. Amazon later tried to hire me as their chief scientist to do the same thing. And you may or may not be aware, but one of the projects I would have run, though I said no, because I told them it wouldn't work, is they trained up a big deep neural network on all of their hiring history to try and take bias out of their hiring process. And did the exact opposite. It would not hire women, period. It's actually relatively easy to understand if you've done any work in machine learning, because all it does is reflect its training sets. It's just history, played back at you. Well, what do you imagine the hiring history, and more particularly in this case, the promotion history of Amazon is? It's not good for women, which is the whole reason they wanted to build this thing. So they had this unfixably sexist system that wouldn't work. I told them, but they tried anyways. So I had this string of startups. I've ended up founding 6 companies over the year in education and in labor and workforce. I've been the chief scientist at 2 others in health and neuroscience. Now I get to sit on the boards of companies. It just takes a lot less of your time. You get to pretend that you're just so smart. 1 hour a month is enough to affect the outcomes of the world. But some of them, in fact, one of them, I don't know if it was on the screen earlier, but one of them is a company called Optoceutics, actually jointly founded here at UC Berkeley and Copenhagen. And we're doing the very thing I talked about. We're building devices that use phasic stimulation of prefrontal cortex to reduce symptomology, both behavioral and biological symptomology of Alzheimer's. We have some cool new research, which I can't share because it's still embargoed, but I can say from previous research, for example, in mice, we see reduced plaque loads, we see changes in behavior and cognitive performance, and some really new results with human beings using the same technology that shows after 36 months on 24 different measures, in all but one of them, people are cognitively and biologically better off after using these systems. I wanted to build cyborgs, which sounds like I'm talking about the Borg, but actually I'm talking about this. I want to build better people, and I realize better in this context is a loaded term. But I bet we can all agree that having the last 5 years of your life, recognizing your loved ones, knowing who you are, looking out at the world, not as a terrifying mystery, but as yourself, is a better life. I didn't know that I'd truly get the chance to build stuff like this, but now we do. We get to build cyborgs in the best, most positive sense. My new company, I promised myself I'd never found another company, and then right in the middle of lockdown, we developed some systems that could predict off of social media feeds when kids were likely to commit suicide. I've had the chance to work on some hard things, and I mean hard in the sense that's most important. Hard because people are suffering or they're dying. I built an AI system to reunite orphan refugees with their extended family members. In 2011, my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and that diagnosis came with a 4-day stay at Oakland Pediatric Critical Intensive Care Unit. It was pretty horrible. So when we got home, I hacked all of his medical equipment, broke several federal US laws, and built the first ever AI for diabetes. These things are hard. Turns out often they're not hard in a technical sense. I actually used a model of predictive coding from the rabbit retina and just adapted it to my son. If you'd asked an endocrinologist, there's nothing to predict about diabetes. We know everything about the biophysics of insulin and digestion. But I'm a mom, and I could see my son's every 5 minutes coming out of a device called a continuous glucose monitor, his time-varying blood glucose levels, milligrams per deciliter. And to me, that was a story. I could see if, as a kindergartner at school, if he was having a good day or a bad day. I could tell if he was anxious. Literally, we actually changed the school policy because we could see our son's blood glucose levels skyrocketing every morning. But we also, I cyborged him up. I'd hacked all of his stuff so we could see that his galvanic skin response wasn't changing, and nor was his heart rate. So, his galvanic skin response was, but not his movement, and his heart rate was going up. So he was essentially having anxiety attacks every morning, which turns out drives up your blood glucose levels. And so we could see this and realize, oh, this isn't a disease problem. This is because a bunch of 5-year-olds were actually being thrown into an undifferentiated room with a whole bunch of older students, and they were all scared. And as soon as they made a change and had the kindergartner separate, suddenly our son's blood glucose levels went down. By the way, that's another important takeaway for you. Many of you are going to have the chance to work on incredibly hard problems throughout your life. Scientific, engineering, legal, business, doesn't matter. All the problems that come to me in my life, my starting point is to assume that we don't understand what's going on. Start from scratch on everything. Don't reject existing wisdom, but question yours own most of all. And so we reject it, and we were able to go through and build these things, and then just give it away. I got to get on phone calls with engineers at all the biggest device makers. We just told them how to build it. No patent, nothing. I figured if more people would be alive, I already got the benefit. My son's life was better. If more people got to be alive, that was it. That was the cherry on top. And that was all I cared about. Oh gosh, the second half of the story. So this has been my life. is using machine learning as a tool to study brains, to study behavior, to study education, hiring, healthcare. We're able to predict onset of postpartum depression in women and bipolar disorder, manic episodes, all of this sort of stuff. And it all seems right. When I was born, when I was a little kid, I grew up in a valley just south of here, about 2 hours south. A little valley. John Steinbeck, the Nobel Prize-winning author, wrote a book about the little valley I grew up in, called The Pastures of Heaven. So I grew up in the pastures of heaven. It also, not coincidentally, happens to be west of East of Eden. So I grew up in a pretty good place, more classically known as Monterey. And although literally the specific little valley, pastures of heaven. My dad was a doctor, my mom was a teacher. I had a pretty good life ahead of me. In fact, I was supposed to win a Nobel Prize. Now, I don't mean this in the sense that my parents were unduly hard on me or anything. It was genuinely just an expectation. When you grow up, you win a Nobel Prize. And the more I tried to be that person, the worse everything got. As I said, the course of my life was very different than my wife's, and probably very different than yours. By the time I reached high school, I was sleeping through most of my classes. And the biggest trouble I ever got in, I forged a letter from my parents insisting that I stay in all of the honors classes that I was sleeping through. Did they think I was going to stay awake in the non-honors classes? Even more boring? Because of standardized test scores, I actually got to go to university. And I almost immediately flunked out. And I gave up on life, and I ended up homeless. Now, the reason everyone expected me to win a Nobel Prize was because my dad grew up as a sharecropper in Kansas. Now, Kansas in the 1930s is a hard life. Being a sharecropper in Kansas in the 1930s, in a little town that Dorothy's never even heard of, is a hard life. I had no idea. When I grew up, I had no idea how poor my dad was. When he graduated at the top of his class for the entire state of Kansas. Like many of you maybe, he was the National Merit Scholar, got full scholarships everywhere, and didn't go. Because what's the point? What's the point of going to some technical school halfway across the country if you're just going to end up back on the farm, MIT? So we went to University of Kansas, not a terrible school. Tutored Wilt Chamberlain in chemistry, famous chemist. Who also happened to have scored 100 points in a basketball game. And was always disappointed that he never really lived out his actual potential. And in some ways that was on me. I was supposed to be that. I was supposed to make that difference. And boy, did I not achieve that. So, effectively the same person flunked out of UC San Diego and came back 10 years later and did their entire degree in a single year and got perfect grades in every class. And the main difference there was the first time through, I was doing it for someone else. I was trying to be the person everyone thought I should be, including me. I didn't have a real reason for doing what I was doing. The second time through, I knew what it was like to wonder where your next meal was coming from. I knew what it was like to cross off days on a calendar because that last day was going to be your last day. And I wanted to make a difference. I got a second chance. Whether it was economics or building cyborgs, I got a chance to give someone, maybe just one person, the same thing I got, a second chance. And so I built this stuff. And nowadays, at what I do in my day job, if you will, I was just in Puebla and Mexico City doing this, I run a philanthropic lab. And people bring us problems. Dr. Ming, my daughter has 500 seizures a day, please save her life. Dr. Ming, my son can't enter REM sleep. holy shit, is that rare? It's like 5 people in the whole world. Sorry, that was a curse word. That family lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right between Harvard and MIT. No one could figure out what was going on with this kid, so they called me. Dr. Ming, my daughter, has a life-threatening egg allergy. That was easy, because I found a lab that had just invented a tool to detect egg proteins in foods. Dr. Ming, our company has bias in its promotion process, but we don't know how to measure it. Can you help us actually build an economic model to actually measure the cost of our bad promotions? Dr. Ming, our country doesn't know what to do about education policy. The UN doesn't know what to do about AI policy. If I think my team and I can make a meaningful difference, I pay for everything. And if we actually invent anything, we just give it away. It is the worst startup idea of all time. Endless demand, no revenue. But my life, at least the second half, has been very good to me. And I want to do this for the rest of my life. In fact, when my ideas work, it costs me way more money than when I don't work. What an astonishing privilege to be able to lead a life where you get to make other people's lives better. Whether it's engineering, or art, or law, it doesn't matter. In fact, one of the areas that I do research in is what is the future of work, particularly in the context of jerks like me building AIs that presumably do people's jobs, or at least their skills. This is the important thing to walk away with here for all of you thinking about university, grad school, work, and careers. It feels like every decision you're going to make for this next year is going to be the most important decision in your life. And it's not true. Not to scare the parents in here, but it's not true. You, short of pulling a trigger, you can't do worse with your life than I did. And I came back from that. There's no decision you can make that is so terrible that you can't come back and do something amazing. Don't make those terrible decisions, please. But just know the future of work is your ability to explore the unknown. It is your unique perspective on the world. The things I build, AI, it's going to start doing more and more of all the routine work, even very complex things that normally take a university degree to learn how to do, read an X-ray, analyze a contract for loopholes and legalese, write code. I don't need people doing the same boring thing. At Sokos Labs, I have one interview question. Pitch me a mad science project. And this is how we do it. For an hour, we work together, collaboratively, to figure out how to make it work. And if I think we have a better idea together than I would have had by myself, then you have the job. That's your value proposition to this world. It's you. Your genuine, unique perspective. Marry that up with some kick-ass math skills. Hell yes. But, learn to be a master craftsman of some amazing tools. But it's you, the craftsman, the craftswoman, craftsperson. Boy, that's an awkward word. You're the one that actually matters. And I say this as practical as I can to the parents. This is the recipe of a great job. I'm not interested in hiring people that know how to code, even if they went to a fancy school. I don't bring grad students in because they know neuroscience. I can teach them all that. Those are just skills. I need people that are creative, adaptive, and not just problem solvers, problem explorers. I need to point over a hill and say, I think there's something interesting over there. Go figure it out. Let me know if you need some help. That is the job of the future, no matter what field you're looking at. And you need to be willing to make some sacrifices along the way. The people that have the best lives are the people that go out. Let me end on this one. It's a good line. I actually recently added together all of the data points I've looked at across my career. And it's something like 9.7 trillion data points, which you can get much bigger if you work at Google. But for the kind of work I do, where we're looking at things like data from the Make-A-Wish Foundation, or my own son's diabetes data. Accumulating that size of data set is pretty impressive. And I've looked at what things predict the best lives. Money, wealth and income, sure. Number of friends you have, happiness, psychological well-being, type 2 diabetes risk, ischemic heart disease, mortality, morbidity in general, all cause. Let's just throw all of those down as the kind of things that make up a better life. And what we find, the most important thing for you to understand, all of those data points, is that if you want a better life, if you want an amazing life, you have to give it to someone else. So, if anyone wants to ask me some questions about actual algorithms and stuff, I'll hang around for a little bit. But that is the end of my pompous jackass routine. So long that they just kick me out, like a clown comes out and sweeps me off the stage. So, questions, absolutely, please, go right ahead.
Yes, so thank you so much, first of all, Dr. Vivian Ming. That was a very inspiring talk. And we'll take questions from the audience right now. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Yes.
Yes.
Will you be staying for the presentations?
Oh my gosh, so here's the honest truth. I just got back from Mexico City, and tomorrow I have 2 kids, and I promised them my weekend. But when are the presentations?
Around 10:15.
10:15. I'll stay as long as I can. I'll call my family up and have them hike up the hill and stay here. I'd be happy to. Now, if what you're really asking is, please don't stay for the presentations, I can do that too. I'm yours to command.
Thank you.
My question was sort of like, how did you go from doing like AI and like neuroscience to like being able to explore so many different fields of science?
So the technical reason is the sort of loose joke I made earlier about math. What am I ever going to do with that? Math is math. And once you have a foundation there, I genuinely mean it when I say I don't really care whether you study neuroscience if you want to come into my lab, even if we're going to work on a neuroscience project. So I'm not saying knowing the factual content of economics, psychology, neuroscience, you know, the sort of softer side of things isn't valued, and even biology and so forth. But if you have a pretty solid mathematical foundation, which I came to later, so again, even that is something you can come to later, then that affords you the ability to go through. I read more economics papers now than anything else, which, if you're not familiar, is in fact a very mathematical field, although I've never read more spherical cow papers in my life. Here are these 2 variables, and they explain all of macroeconomics. So there's that side. But the other side is I'm constantly looking with an interdisciplinary eye. So as I mentioned, for example, with the diabetes, I'm not an endocrinologist. I took some neuroendocrinology courses in grad school, but really it was not my focus area. I mean, I build fake brains on computers. I was smart enough to get out of the whole sticking wires in cats things, or rabies retrovirus in the cats. It's all very messy and ugly. As Jack Gallant here at UC Berkeley once said to my advisor and I was in grad school, he says, I know what you theoretical neuroscientists think. You think we empiricists are all stupid, and maybe you're a little bit right. But we think you're lazy, and we're definitely right. But when you start to look across and try and find commonalities, so again, I had this algorithm about predictive coding, just kind of exactly what I wanted to do, predict whether my son's blood glucose levels would go up or down in the future. And it was one-dimensional versus, you know, the kinds of models we were working on, like image coding, which were massively high-dimensional. So finding those touch points surprisingly few people still in science today are interdisciplinary. Just not well rewarded career-wise. It's not that it doesn't happen, but it should happen so much more than it does. There are some great examples of people doing that here at BC Berkeley, but again, I was the student representative. There's a graduate research program called IGERT, so I was on an IGERT fellowship, which is an integrative research fellowship, to mash things together. So for me, that was machine learning, neuroscience, and psychology. And mashing those together, and I was the student rep for the national conference in Washington, D.C. And we showed up at this, and we all did our presentations, and then the secretary or whatever of NSF came out and gave a talk, and the first question came from a student out in the audience and said, so, you funded us to do all this integrative research, but all the departments want to hire for specialists, so how are we going to get jobs? And she fairly honestly said, we were actually just hoping you all would be so awesome they'd have to hire you. But that's why. So I get to walk into new problems, and I get the novice mind for free. I don't have to sort of pretend I don't know what's going on. I have my mathematical foundation. I have my insights from neighboring fields. I have the starting assumption that if people are still struggling with this problem, then the core assumptions about it must be wrong. And then we dive in. And to give you a very concrete sense of what that process is, probably very different than most of you would think a way of approaching science. When we did the project with the Make-A-Wish Foundation, which is to see whether the wishes themselves and their nature actually changes the survival rates of the kids. And they do. They didn't have any data. When I asked them what data they had, they sent me a spreadsheet. It was like 26 kilobytes, just a bunch of names and addresses. They didn't have anything. So I went out with the wish granters, the people that actually ring that doorbell and meet the family. Every meeting is tears. Every meeting is tears. And you watch them. And I looked for places where we could make a difference. So that's another thing, is it's a very meta thing when I talk about what the future of work is exploring the unknown, and that sounds a little vague. I'm writing a book about it. But I actually mean that in some concrete ways, to think in a metacognitive way about how you approach a problem which we have failed to make progress on over many generations of research. And the real commonalities in how you can approach a novel problem, even if conceptually it's outside your field. And I would say this, there's a radio show turned podcast about a sort of famous class that Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, did. He taught the Physics 101 class at Caltech, and he started off with this question. If you knew civilization was going to end, and a tiny group of people would continue and rebuild all of civilization, what is the one piece of knowledge that you would transmit into the future? And he used it as a motivation to teach this entire class, because his one thing was the atomic theory of matter, which is not a bad one, particularly if you're a physicist, spherical cows and all. But and they then interviewed a number of other people that offered them up, generally fairly terrible. But for me, I think the greatest idea in history is the scientific method. It is the idea that the world is understandable and measurable. And that's solid. But it's actually the second part that is in so short supply, sometimes even in the sciences, but definitely in the rest of the world, that's the most critical. The only way to be truly confident about those measurements is to question yourself. Try to prove yourself wrong. Don't prove yourself right. Prove yourself wrong. When you fail to do that, now you have an insight. So being able to walk into a new field, it's so much easier to set aside your preconceptions and your ego that's tied up in your theories and genuinely, aggressively try to prove yourself wrong until you finally find something that actually moves you forward. So that's how I've had the chance of doing this work. And the other thing is that you, likely all of you will discover across your life, is as far as the rest of the world concerned, your job title is smart person. Pretty soon, people will just start inviting you. I was once asked to give a talk about interoperability in the banking system. I don't know anything about that. But I said, oh yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. Every time I give a talk, I mean, people pay me an ungodly amount of money to give a talk. I mean that genuinely, it is unconscionable. And the reason I do that is every time I give one of those talks, like for this billionaire in Mexico City that I just did, that pays for one of our projects. We get to do a new kid that's dying of some exotic disease, or help some company that genuinely wants to improve its hiring. You know, that's powerful, but genuinely you get to learn pretty quickly. You're just a professional smart person. And everyone thinks because you're smart at one thing, you have the answers to everything. And that's what they'll ask you to give them, is the answers. Resist that. You are as absent of absolute answers as anyone else. But maybe you can help them explore and find a better way than what they're currently doing. All right, I've been talking for a while, but if it's okay, I can do maybe one more? Oh, there's a few of them. I'm just, because I can see a little clearly, I'm gonna go right here.
Okay, so I had mentioned the word real a lot. How did you get to know so many collaborators and all of your fields?
So I really don't know any. I am notoriously bad with names, people that think they're my friends and I don't even remember who they are. I joke a lot, I fake it on the stage, but my family was built for lockdown. Stuck at home for 2 years? Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, turns out there's a downside to the whole pandemic thing, but this wasn't your question. The upside is, for the last 2 years, Facebook and Amazon reached out to me and said, we've never sent everyone home before. How do we do inclusion? And how do we do innovation? Through Zoom. So for 2 years, I have been secretly monitoring everyone's conversations on Zoom and Meet. And looking at what are the ingredients of innovation. And also looking at what actually produces inclusion in any context. Obviously, I didn't get a talk on that. If you're curious, we can chat about it later. But even in the midst of genuine horrific tragedies, there's an opportunity to understand the world better and different. So in this case, something that I actually highly recommend to all of you, and it will feel terrifying for at least some of you, do good work and give it away. It sounds terrifying because I didn't say get rich doing it. It's perfectly fine to get rich doing these things. In fact, find a thing you're not just willing to do for free, you are willing to spend everything on to make it happen. You believe so much on this, you would do it even if no one ever knew you did. Then never tell anyone that you would do it for free, and they will pay you crazy money to do the thing you truly think should happen. So what I do is I build things, and then I just put them out there. Sometimes they turned into startups. They're always with a lot more heart than good business sense, but again, I got lucky a couple of times. But many of them have just been these free projects. So I built them, and I put them out there. And occasionally they help people, occasionally not. Having no social skills means I never go talk to other people. People come and say, could you help with this? And it's because I tried. Even when things don't work, I tried and I put it out there. And people notice it. And if you're lucky, the New York Times, the Atlantic, or the BBC notices it, and then lots of people notice. But it didn't start there. It started with, here's something that I think should exist. I don't know how to do it, but I'm going to do it in a very public way. Just expose all the flaws in my thinking and everything, but I'm genuinely going to try and make a difference. And I'm going to put it out there. And if it doesn't work, I have just learned something, because that's the scientific method. I proved myself wrong. I had an idea, turns out it didn't work. But now I know more than I know before. I always learn whenever I do a project. So that's been my approach. And by the way, that's not the approach for everyone. I do a lot of work looking at what predicts long-term life outcomes. Social skills is a huge predictor of long-term life outcomes. By the way, even for software developers, predicts quality of code that you write. Now, not a lot of software developers have super high social skills, but it turns out it's just as predictive of their quality of work as it is for salespeople. So here's what, I guess to summarize that field of research and offer it back to you, what we see even in the most elite performers, Nobel Prize winners, athletes, entrepreneurs, business leaders, whatever they might be, is not that there's one single quality, trait, skill that they have. Rather, they have a diversity of strengths. I have some strengths of my own. Turns out social is not one of them. That's another thing. Everyone has weaknesses. Literally everyone. There is no one amongst hundreds of millions of people we've looked at. No one is perfect. No one has universal strengths. Probably reasons why that's true. But here's the difference between truly elite performers and near successes. The elite performers were aware of their weaknesses and developed compensatory strategies for them. I'm not great with social, so I hire grown-ups. So I don't have to be one. I can tinker away in my lab, I can pretend to be a mad scientist on stage and look like I'm an actual grown-up. And then I have people that have real social skills actually handle all of those relationships and keep them alive and make people falsely believe, no, Dr. Main's thinking about you all the time. When I started my first startup, I thought I had to be like this perfect executive and master everything and be a great manager. I'm not a great manager. I have this instinct to just like, you're my collaborator, let's work together, you're struggling with something, move on to next collaborator. That's terrible. There's certainly not if you're talking about your grad student. You made a commitment to them. And I work hard, because that's, for me, that's hard work, trying to actually find a connection and shepherd someone along. But in other areas, I realized, you know what, there are people that are great managers. I should work with them. In fact, when we look at last thing and last field of research, looking a lot at this question of innovation and what predicts innovation, a very related concept is collective intelligence. What raises the measurable IQ, GQ of a team. One of the things we find is it's this concept of complementary diversity. The people share things on that team, but they're also genuinely different. And they bring those strengths together. Cohorts of students that are brought together, that are diverse, have better outcomes. They're faster to graduate from university, they have better jobs afterwards. And we see this play out as well. By the way, it turns out the exact same models. You apply it to political polarization in the US, or it turns out anywhere in the world, and we see the same phenomenon. When social networks become less diverse, people coalesce around core ideas, they stop exploring the unknown, and you get increased political polarization. The same curse for innovation is also right there in our interpersonal lives. So, thank you all so much. Best of luck for the rest of the day.
So much, Dr. Vivian Bing, and we have a special gift for you. And can we have a round of applause, please?
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Absolutely. I would add this, as you can imagine, in Puebla, Mexico City, they gave me tequila, and of which I was left thinking, you realize I'm about to get on a plane.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.